I knew when this mountain in my way is gonna move. Hope it's okay to tell the truth. Sometimes the doubt starts to win. Yeah, I'd be lying if I told you I was anything but weak. Right now my struggle's all I see, but I'm not giving in. My story will not end in defeat, 'cause nothing can stop an unstoppable God. He's not afraid of impossible odds. This is the promise that I'm standing on. Nothing can stop an unstoppable God. Listen to the lie that says it can't be done. I know my war's already won, and I'm claiming victory, 'cause I know who is fighting for me. 'Cause nothing can stop an unstoppable God. He's not afraid of impossible odds. This is the promise that I'm standing on. Unstoppable God. This is the promise that I'm standing on. Nothing can stop an unstoppable God.
Well, hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm David Robinson, the senior minister at CCC, and I am so glad you're spending part of your day here. Stick around to the end. We have a special announcement of sorts at the end of our service that I don't want you to miss. Now, we've been in this series called Same Difference, where we're exploring the book of 1 Corinthians from the Bible, and it has a lot to teach us because, in part, we're the same as the Corinthians. I mean, we're separated by 20 centuries. They were in the first century. Here we are in the 21st century. But the issues they faced and the problems they had, they're eerily similar to issues and problems we face today. I mean, some things are different, but a whole lot's the same. We could call Corinthians when thinking about this book of the Bible. And one of the biggest issues the church at Corinth had to deal with was in this realm of sex and sexuality. The first century Greco-Roman world was an almost anything goes kind of culture. And Corinth was that on steroids. So it's understandable that when the Apostle Paul established a church in Corinth and folks started coming to see the reality and truth of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, they started placing their faith and hope in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, they brought who they were into the church too. And in a lot of cases, they brought old sexual habits, old patterns and behaviors and beliefs surrounding the sexual realm with them. And they were a mess. And let's face it, our culture tends to be a mess too when it comes to sex and sexuality. And I don't know if there's any area we need more wisdom. Our culture needs more help and wisdom than in this area, because sex and sexuality is a powerful, powerful thing. It can be such a gift when it's handled rightly. It can express intimacy and love like nothing else in the world. And on the other hand, it can be so devastating when it's abused or mishandled. And there's something in the human heart that tells us that sexuality is to be prized and guarded, as difficult as that can be at times. We kind of know this instinctively. I think we ought to handle this area with care. So let's think about this today. We come to chapters 6 and 7 out of 1 Corinthians. If you have a Bible in one form or fashion, get to the 6th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And what we see here in 1 Corinthians 6 and 7, it tells us a lot about what it means to be God's people belonging to God. This is one of the ways that Christians are to be very distinctive people. And here's what we have here. And here's what I want us to see. In these chapters, Christianity gave the world a revolutionary understanding of sex and singleness and romance and marriage. Because first off, the Apostle Paul is writing this. He brings up to this young church in Corinth two different attitudes, two views towards sex in the culture, his culture, which also exists in our culture today. And both are opposed to each other, and both are way off. Neither of them is right. Neither of them gets it. Now, the first one is a little hard to get this reading in our English translation. You know, the first verse 13 there is where Paul is quoting somebody else. And he says this, he says, "Food for the stomach and the stomach for food, but God will destroy them both." Now, let me paraphrase this attitude a little bit. This attitude says, hey, sex is just an appetite. Food for the stomach, stomach for food. Paul's quoting someone else who summed up the prevalent view in Greek society that said, the body means nothing. You know, Greek philosophy and thinking saw the soul as good and the body as bad. It's just going to be destroyed, they said. It's just going to burn up. It's not that important, the body. And because of that low view of the body, there were a whole lot of people in Greek society who said, hey, sex really isn't a big problem. It's an appetite. If you get hungry, you get something to eat. If you get thirsty, you get something to drink. If you desire sex, you have sex, because the body isn't really that important. Sex is just an appetite. And then this little addition, he says, but God will destroy them both. It's part of that view that the physical world was temporary and not all that important. And therefore, it's not what you do with your body that matters. It's what you do with your soul that really matters. Now, the other approach, the view Paul deals with there, he quotes somebody else. The Corinthians, actually, they had written to him. And at the beginning of chapter 7, verse 1, he says this, "Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with their own husband." Now this view also comes out of the Greek understanding that the body doesn't matter. And Paul quotes somebody else who basically says, sex might be a necessary thing, but it's a little dirty and somewhat defiling. And if you really were a spiritual person, you wouldn't have anything to do with it, even if you're married. So those are two opposite approaches. You know, one is sex is just an appetite. You know, perfectly okay to have sex with somebody when you need to or want to, no problem. The other view is that, you know, sex is terrible, really. It's dirty, it's defiling. You could kind of stay away from it. Now, it's ironic because in our culture, we also face these same two approaches too. In fact, they may be the two biggest views we've got in our society today. Some have the attitude that says, you know, sex is just another one of the appetites, and it's a natural need, and it's unhealthy not to exercise it. You'll hear that a lot. And then you have another attitude or understanding towards sex that says, hey, it's almost unmentionable. It's necessary for procreation, but it's essentially something to steer clear of. And Paul doesn't ascribe to either of these views. He's just stating them here. Paul instead says both these views are absolutely and completely wrong. They just miss it. So what does he say? Well, first off, in verse 18 there, he says, flee sexual immorality. Now, the English term sexual immorality, it's pretty vague, but the Greek term he uses is not. He says flee porneia. That's the word there, which is where we get our word pornography from. But he's not talking about pornography there. Porneia meant to have sex with someone that you weren't married to. He had a perfectly good word he could have used for adultery. That is, to be married and have sex with someone that you're not married to. But he didn't use that word. He used a word that meant any kind of sex outside of marriage, whether you're married or not. And he doesn't just say in verse 18, you know, it'd be good for you to refrain from having sex outside of marriage. No, he says, have nothing to do with it. Flee from it. So when we read that, we think, well, that seems like the second view of sex. You know, Dave, that's the one that's saying, hey, it's dirty and defiling. Steer clear of it. But no, you see, the key to understanding Paul's view, and really God's view on this whole thing, is to understand the term one flesh. In verse 16, he says this amazing statement. He writes, do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. Now, what's this mean, one flesh? And when we read this, you know, we think, oh yeah, he's talking about the sexual physical union. But that can't be all he's talking about here. And I'll show us why. And no offense to the translators of the Bible. I mean, it's very hard to translate the Bible, but that's a really rough translation into our English of the original Greek words. Because the Greek term is sarx. It's a word for flesh, not the word for body so much as for flesh. And it's quoting from the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, the second chapter, which is the template for marriage, where it says, a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Now, this is incredibly important. This idea of one flesh is not just talking about it in a physical sense. He certainly is talking about sex in a physical sense, but it's oh so much more than that. If Paul only meant it in a physical sense, he would have said, don't you know that when you become physically united with someone, you're physically united with them? And that would be from the redundancy school of redundancy school. And that wouldn't be worth saying. And that's not what he's saying. And that's not what he means. And we got to get this if we're going to understand sex and marriage at all. Because the term flesh in the Bible, unlike the term for body, which is somo, the term flesh has a broader meaning than just the physical. In fact, there are a couple of places where the Bible says, hey, God says in the Bible, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Well, does that mean I will only pour out my spirit on the body? No, it means all persons. So when Paul says, and Genesis says, and Jesus says, a lot of people try to make the case that Jesus didn't say anything about sex and sexuality, but yes, he did. He says the exact same thing we're looking at here from Genesis 2. They all say that sex makes two people one flesh, saying something much more than just they're physically united. And what Paul's saying here is pretty astounding, and it was incredibly unique. He's saying sex in any circumstance is designed to radically transform and supplement you. Sex is a way to donate yourself to someone so deeply that the two become one unit. The two become one. The two become one flesh, not just physically, but in their entire personhood. That you are both yourself and yet so radically supplemented that you're not the same. It's transformative. Anthony Thistleton, he says it like this. He said, Paul was far ahead of first century assumptions in perceiving the sexual act as one of self-commitment, which deeply involves the entire person, not merely body parts. Paul is saying, he writes, that sex is meant by God to be the full giving of one's entire self to the one to whom you belong. See, Paul is saying that God did not invent sex simply to be a necessary act for procreation. And God didn't even just make sex as a way of self-gratification or self-expression. Paul says that sex was designed by God as a way to do radical self-donation. To put it another way, Paul is saying you should never have physical oneness without having whole life oneness. To put it another way, God's saying you must never get physically naked and vulnerable with someone without becoming vulnerable in your entire life. You must not become physically vulnerable with someone and hold on to your independence. You must become legally, economically, socially, emotionally, in every way committed. You must give up your independence. And if you do that, if whole body giving is done in the context of whole life commitment, within a marriage covenant, it can result in deep soul nurture and deep personal transformation and completion. Because sex is not just the mingling of two bodies. It's the mingling of two souls. And that's why there's so much brokenness around sex. It's why people carry such heavy burdens for years when they're outside God's guidelines for it. It's why when you have sex with someone, well, the relationship has changed. You've changed. They've changed because two have become one. Souls have mingled together. You know, as Hugh Hefner some years ago now, who famously said, we should view having sex with someone like asking someone to play a game of tennis. It's just a physical act. And that couldn't be more wrong because it's one flesh. It's mingling of souls. You're not supposed to be physically one with someone unless you're one with them in every other way. If you say, I want to be naked with you physically, but I don't want to be naked with you, socially and legally and financially and emotionally and personally and all kinds of other ways. I don't want to be married. I don't want to have our money be the same. I don't want to lose my independence. I want to be one with you physically, but I don't want to be one with you in any other way. Well, Paul is saying, and God is saying, well, that's an absolute tragedy and a violation of how the whole thing is designed. See, we live in a society in which it's considered totally normal to give away your body without giving yourself, to give your body, to have sex, and hold on to your independence, to hold on to your life, to keep individual control. But Paul is saying that when you have sex outside of marriage, you're actually abusing and dishonoring and destroying this incredible person-shaping commitment mechanism of deep soul nurture and personal transformation. When you give your body to someone without giving your soul to someone, you're destroying your commitment apparatus. And listen, my hope in talking about this today is not to add guilt or shame or make somebody feel bad for choices they may have or may have not made in their life. I want us to understand the big pillars of what God wants as the foundation for this arena. See, Paul has a view of sex, as the scholars all say, it is so lofty and high and beyond anything that had been written up until that time. It's astounding. And it's not the sex is an appetite approach, and it's not the sex is dirty approach at all. Christianity gave the world a revolutionary view of sex that had never been seen before. Now, he goes on and he gives a revolutionary view of singleness and marriage that had never seen before too. So let's keep going into chapter 7 because he sets a balance that no other culture had ever come up with, and it's something we really need to see too. I'll paraphrase verses 27 and 28 of chapter 7 a little bit. He essentially says, hey, are you married? Great. Don't try to become single. Marriage can be a really great thing. And then he says, well, are you single? Well, that's great. Don't kill yourself to get married. Marriage is hard and it's a lot of work. If you're married, that's fine. That's a great way to be as a Christian. If you're single, well, that's fine too. That's a great way to be as a Christian. Don't be too eager to change statuses. And this was ridiculously shocking in that day about singleness and marriage. And it's a little shocking today too, because he sets a balance that no other culture had ever come up with. I mean, you might know that in traditional cultures, the stigma is, hey, if you're a single person long-term, you're weird. Like, what's wrong with you? That's the stigma. You're nobody unless somebody loves you and you're having babies with them. Traditionally, cultures have tended to make idols out of marriage. Whereas there are plenty of places in our culture, in our country, where people are so cynical about marriage that they make an idol out of independence. And Paul doesn't do any of that. And that's because Paul knows. And we know, because of other places in the Bible, like Ephesians 5, that marriage is a mirror. It's an image. It's striking at the perfect closure, the perfect relationship we're going to have one day with God through Jesus Christ. You see, sex is a foretaste of the absolute oneness we're going to have when we meet God face to face one day, ultimately, which is why he says earlier, hey, flee any sort of sexual immorality because you were made for God. And if that's true, then we also know that sex and marriage, even the best marriages, will never really satisfy that part of our hearts that will never be satisfied until we're united with Jesus, because you were made for God, ultimately, supremely. If you're single, can you possibly get this balance and this perspective and this ultimate hope? You see, too many people are looking to the hope of some romantic partner for fulfillment, and it's just a setup for a big disappointment, because only Jesus Christ can ultimately fulfill you. We have a future, as Christians, we have a future that's destined for Him, with Him, because we were made for Him. It's Jesus, the true spouse and ultimate maker and lover of your soul. And when we see that, to the degree that we see that, only then can we have this balanced approach to marriage and sex and singleness and romance. You won't be afraid of or make independence an idol. And on the other hand, you won't make it an idol. You won't lust too much after it. You won't say, I'm nobody unless I'm married. The gospel creates this balance that's pretty astounding. So listen, I get that there are all kinds of questions that come up when we're talking about these two chapters here. I'm not naive to the idea that we're not covering everything in this realm. But this is a starting point for figuring everything else out. And if we don't get this, the rest is going to be a mess too. Sex can be incredible when it's experienced as whole life donation in the context of a permanent, lifelong covenant of marriage. When it's experienced outside of that, we're doing damage to our souls and violating how God designed the whole thing. And listen, if you're single and you never have sex, your life is not incomplete because you were made for God and only He can fulfill you ultimately. So if you're having trouble with sexual self-control, and I'm sure there are many who would fall into that camp, I mean, think about this. Have you ever noticed if you're hungry and you want to eat something, but there are no places to get anything to eat, your hunger is kind of magnified. But if you were to say, hey, I'm on a diet and I'm going to be thin and svelte and trim or, whatever, because I'm on a diet. I mean, it's hard to be on a diet, but you've made a decision and you've got something in front of you that you really, really want and you can do it. In other words, if you want to eat something and people aren't letting you, it's crazy and almost unbearable. But if you've made up your mind to fast or to diet because of something you've got out in front of you that you really want to accomplish or get to, well, it's hard, but it's bearable. So if you're not married, you may want to think of it like you're sexually fasting for the Lord. Make the decision. I mean, it's still hard, but it's not crazy. It's a very, very, very good thing to honor God with your sexuality. And I want to say to anybody who's trying to honor God's boundaries and guidance when it comes to this, I know it can feel like you're swimming upstream and you're the only one, but you are not. And it is a good thing to honor God in this way. So don't give up. You keep going. Recognize the story we find ourselves in. I have a feeling you're aware that the Olympics have been going on these last couple of weeks. You may have heard about the Dutch cyclist, I'll try to pronounce her name, Annemiek van Vleuten, who on day number 2 of the Tokyo Olympics threw her arms up in the air as she crossed what she thought was the finish line after the 4-hour women's Olympic road race. She thought she had finished the race and won the gold medal, but she hadn't. She had stopped just short, about 80 feet or so, way too soon. The real finish line was still out in front of her, and she kind of started celebrating too early. There was some confusion, and she had the wrong finish line. And I got to tell you, gang, we got to reset our sights on the right finish line. Sift through the confusion of our times and reset your sights on the fact that you were created in the image of a good God who's your ultimate destination and the only one who can fulfill you. And I know there are some who have really blown it sexually. And in some ways you think either, man, Dave, I've missed the bus on this one. And so what's it matter at this point anyway? Or sometimes it can be so hard to control yourself sexually because you still feel so ashamed for the things you've done or have been done to you in the past. But that's not the way it is in God's economy, in God's kingdom, within His church, through Jesus. There was another picture from the Olympics you may have seen. It was of Sifan Hassan, the Ethiopian-born distance runner who was competing in a heat to qualify for the women's 1,500-meter race final. It's like when they go around the track 4 times or something like that. And partway through the race, it was just after they rang the bell for the final lap, she got tangled up in the pack and she trips and falls. And this is the Olympics. This is what she's trained her whole life for. And the pack now, after she falls, the pack is way ahead of her now. And she, in an incredible way, she gets back up and she not only caught up to the pack, not only finished high enough to qualify for the final, but actually won her heat. And I got to tell you, that's possible for you too, gang. If you stumbled somewhere along the way, you've really blown it sexually, or you feel like you're dirty and defiled and defeated, like you'll never be normal, or you'll never be able to run this race the way God wants you to, or something like that. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be the end for you. We serve the God who restores and renews and remakes. And keep in mind, every single person in our church has committed adultery on Jesus. Everybody. You realize how many times in the Bible it compares us turning our back on God, cheating on Him spiritually. It compares that to adultery. I mean, He gives us everything. He keeps our hearts pumping, for goodness sake. And anytime we give ourselves to some other lover, we give ourselves over, we make an idol out of money or our career or some person, to other people, to all these idols, we're committing adultery on Him. And He forgives us for it. We're washed, we're sanctified, we're justified. Such were some of you, He says earlier in chapter 6. But in God's sight, we're spotless. So don't let the past haunt you. I mean, some of you may remember that episode when a woman caught in adultery was brought before Jesus for Him to place judgment on her. And instead He says, I forgive you. Go and sin no more. He doesn't say, I do condemn you, so straighten out. He says, I don't condemn you. Now use the grace I showed you as strength to live well. He's forgiven you. And because we have such a tough time believing this and holding on to this, He commanded us to remember His love for us and the price He paid for us on the cross. We were bought with a price. The price of Jesus' body given on the cross and His blood spilled on the cross so we could be clean and new and forgiven and whole. And so I want to encourage you to celebrate communion now. Wherever you're watching this, take some bread and juice and seal up again the knowledge of God's promised love and acceptance and renewal for your life.
is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When darkness seems to hide His face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. My anchor holds within the veil. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When He shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in Him be found, dressed in His righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne.
Well, thanks for tuning in today. I want to encourage you to give to support the mission of CCC, the mission of helping people find their way back to God. It's the most important work in the world. There are a couple ways you can give. You can text CCC White Marsh to the number on the screen, or you can go to the website and give that way. I also want to let you know that next week we've got a school supply drive that's kicking up. You can check out all the details through the website, communitycc.net. It's a great way to support what's going on around here at Community Christian Church. Well, I mentioned that we got a little announcement to make. Appreciate you sticking around to the end. Earlier this week, I got to sit down with Joshua Simonet. I want you to check it out. Hey everybody, I'm here with Joshua Simonet, and Joshua is launching a new church in Baltimore in about a month, a little over a month from now, in September. He's here with us, and we're glad you're here with us. Thanks for being here today.
Good to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself before we get to how you're launching a church.
Well, been married 18 years to my wife, Erica. We have 4 kids. I'm originally from Miami, Florida, moved to the Atlanta area when I was in high school, and then went on to college at a place called Tennessee Tech. I know you're a Vols fan, a little bit different spot. But then from there, went on to the DC area where we've been before coming to Baltimore, and I was involved in a church there for over 7 years. And so that's a little bit about us.
Now, you didn't intend to get involved in the church in DC. And I know you've been a little modest, for how you got to DC, but tell us a little bit about that journey.
Well, I had this dream of playing in the National Football League. I went to Tennessee Tech, as I mentioned earlier, on a football scholarship. And so had the opportunity to play for the Washington football team. That's what brought me to the DC area. Ministry was always going to be in the cards for me at some point. God had revealed that to me, but my focus was playing ball. And so that's initially what brought me to the DC area. And then from there, I transitioned into ministry.
Now, when you first started in ministry, it wasn't to launch a church, senior ministry, anything like that. I think you started out in student ministry, right?
I did. I started out as a youth pastor. And once my playing career was kind of in flux, and I didn't know what was next, I got involved in a church in DC where that same church at some point, needed a youth pastor. I had already been kind of volunteering with young people. And so I jumped in and they offered me a position to be youth pastor. And that's how I got my start.
And then another stop along the way was at National Community Church, right?
Yes.
Tell us how you got there.
I was kind of fresh out of the National Football League into ministry and still trying to reconcile to figure out what was the next season. And it just so happened that National Community Church was the next place for me. I had ended up meeting Mark Batterson, who is the lead pastor there and best-selling author. We've become great friends, and he invited me to be a part of what they were doing. And that was really a next part of the evolution for me in ministry. And it was a great 7-year run there, and have still maintained my relationship with National Community Church.
Yeah, so you've been a campus pastor there and on the teaching team as well. But now you're launching a new church on your own.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's a big jump. I had no intention of ever planting a church. I had the opportunity to meet with a bunch of church planners, while I was at National Community Church. There was a guy who actually lived in Baltimore who reached out to National Community Church. I ended up meeting this guy, and one of his visions was just seeing more churches in Baltimore City, Bible-based and outreach-oriented churches. And he blew me away with his vision for the city. And that was a catalytic moment for us. But that kind of led to this movement towards planting in Baltimore. And eventually God revealed to us that that is what he had next for us. And we talked to National Community Church about it. They were enthusiastic and got behind us. And here we are.
All right, so you're launching in September. Tell me the details around that. What's the church called? Where are you meeting?
Yeah, so we named the church Hope Baltimore. And the reason why we named it Hope Baltimore is because the gentleman that I mentioned, one of the things he told me was, he said, hey, we need more hope in the city. We need more hope dealers. We need people to be hopeful. And so that theme of hope just kind of stood out. And we thought that, we should name this ministry Hope Baltimore. So that's what we decided to do. We're launching September 12th. The neighborhood is called Station North because it's 2 blocks north of Penn Station. The venue is called The Garage, and it's 6 East Lafayette Avenue in Baltimore City.
So we've made a commitment to you, a financial commitment as a church. In fact, CCC, since we began in 2006, we've helped to launch 16 new churches. You're number 16. We're very glad, very honored to be a part of that work.
Thank you.
But how can overall the CCC family help and be a part of this? What do you need?
Well, first and foremost, just really grateful for your financial support and believing in us. That's a huge just joy that we have to have the support of you and several other churches who are just cheering us on. But I think we need the same 3 things that all church plants need. We need prayers, we need people, we need provision. Prayers for just this ministry that God has given us and this mission, and that he would go before us and open the right doors for us as we're engaging in the city. And then people, we need people to join our team. We need people to lead. We need people to, help carry this mission down the road. And then the provision piece we've already mentioned. Just grateful for those who continue to financially support us and who are invested in that way in the ministry.
If you're really excited about what's going on with Joshua and Hope Baltimore, or maybe you live closer to where they're launching, then you can reach out directly to Joshua, find out more information about that. Hey, I tell you, we're fired up and excited about what's going on. Looking forward to seeing what God does through your ministry there, Joshua.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, hey, Joshua, thanks again for being here. I figured since we have you here, I know you're pretty humble earlier, but you're a professional athlete, man. A professional football player. Made it to the NFL. That's a big deal. Yeah. Playing for the Washington Football Club, Miami Dolphins, your kind of hometown team. A lot of people think that professional football players are the greatest athletes on the planet. You know, it does take, that's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah.
But the Olympics are going on. I mean, you got to admit, Olympians are pretty impressive, right?
For sure,
Absolutely. You've been watching the Olympics?
Yes.
Yeah, you got like a favorite Olympic sport?
You know what's interesting? I've been really getting into water polo. I mean, I just don't know how they can stay in the water that long and go back and forth. It's a lot of stamina.
Yeah, it is. I actually have the top 10 signs that you'll never win an Olympic medal, right? It's important for everybody to know. And I appreciate you being willing to give it. So
let's do it.
So here we go. All right, you ready? Top 10 signs you'll never win an Olympic medal. Number 10.
All right. You never passed the presidential fitness test in middle school.
All right, number 9.
Your best event is the couch to fridge 5K.
Number 8.
You insist on wearing floaties when you're in and around a pool.
Number 7.
Your definition of a protein shake includes 4 scoops of ice cream and 3 tablespoons of peanut butter.
Number 6.
Your sports psychologist keeps telling you to give it up.
Number 5.
Even your parents don't think you're good at anything.
Number 4.
Your best dive is the belly flop.
Number 3.
Your neck can't support the weight of a medal.
Sure sign. Number 2.
The dressage horse you got off Craigslist won't stop moving.
And the number 1 sign that you never win an Olympic medal.
All right. Minecraft is still not an Olympic sport.
There you go.